Breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ. The college football playoff will be expanding to 12 teams. That's the latest from our senior college football writer, Dennis Dodd. Now, the new format will take the 6 highest-ranked conference champions and 6 at-large teams. Now, these changes are expected to take effect as early as 2024. The timeline remains fluid. We, of course, have to finalize a number of the finer points of the expansion, but right now, here's what we know. Can expand to 12 teams as early as 2024. 2026 also under consideration. Can be implemented a lot sooner. The 6 highest-ranked conference champions and the at-large teams, but still questions about that. And in terms of the format, and it was a unanimous vote by the board's 11 members. All right, let's bring in the host of Late Kick with Josh Payton, get his reaction to this. Josh, your thoughts on this? 12 teams going to the college football playoff, possibly as early as 2024. What do you think?
Well, I think we knew it was inevitable, so there's not that shockwave. I guess it's a shockwave to see the headline, but it's not a shockwave that it's happening. My personal feel on this may be out of touch with what the majority thinks, but that's okay. Everyone has an opinion on this. Mine is I've hated the concept from the outset. In fact, I would love to go backwards to just the straight BCS format and just take 2 teams. But it's not because I'm anti-progress in the sport. And Jeremy, what really gets old to me are people throwing these lines at you like, well, how could you be against more football? I'm not against more football any more than I'm against more money. I'm just against it when it starts to decrease the value of said money. I'm against more playoff spots when it starts to decrease the value of said sport, in this case, in the regular season, which is college football. The second thing, and I'm just going to make everyone's argument for them that's yelling at the TV right now or their mobile device, well, doesn't this just make the end of the regular season more exciting? Doesn't this just create more meaningful games? In a way, you're right, because in a way, the expansion crowd does love to tout that there will be more games now with playoff implications and ramifications on them. I just ask, what do you give up? Because there is no take, and no give. And I think that when you start to dive deep, even the folks on the expansion side of the fence have been willing to admit, to their credit, it probably won't change who wins the championship. The same elite teams will win the championship, but it's about increasing the excitement of the journey. Well, I remember being in Ann Arbor, Michigan last year and watching Michigan and Ohio State play, knowing there was no safety net under that game. Winner was going to the Big Ten title game and probably the playoff. The loser was going to the Rose Bowl, which is still a nice consolation prize. I remember being at Alabama games over the past few years, including the SEC title game last year, where they knew they had to win or there's not a playoff spot on the line. My point in singling out those games is, even by the expansionist logic, those games feature teams that are actually capable of winning the title if they get in. We're taking the consequence off those games now. You know, even if you lose those games, you're going to be in. Everybody who's capable of winning the title just knows they're in, unless they have massive amounts of injuries. We're taking the implications off those games, and we're putting them onto games that feature teams trying to lock down a 7 seed or a 9 seed or a 12 seed that, even by the own expansionist admission, features teams that won't be able to make it. So the games that feature teams that can win it, there's no implication on those anymore. The games that feature teams that probably will get smashed once they get in, that's the kind of game that's going to have implications on it. But I'm told it's all going to end well at the end of the day, Jeremy, because it's not whether you can win it or not. It's whether you get in that matters, which will last for about 2 or 3 years. And then people will reprogram their mind and they'll come to find that maybe these games we told ourselves were going to mean a whole lot more don't mean as much, because we can't mind trick ourselves every year into pretending like these teams are going to have a shot. This is not basketball. As much as people want to make it basketball, there will be no Cinderella run here. The Cinderella run, I'll tell you exactly what it's going to be. It's Tua goes down, Mac Jones comes in, Bama sneaks into the playoff as a 12 seed. Then, because they have the most talented roster in the country, they spend December getting right, and Cinderella Alabama or Cinderella Ohio State wins the title. That's what you're signing yourself up for here, whether you know it or not.
But Josh, doesn't it actually expand the competitive nature of the entire season? I mean, right now, one loss can sink your season. But with an expanded playoff, does it mean more competition, that games mean more later into the season? It keeps more teams alive.
No, not to me. But then again, I never defined what a meaningful game is by whether it has a playoff tapestry behind it. That's only a recent thing, Jeremy. I mean, only in the last decade has anyone started to call games featuring 8-win and 7-win teams meaningless because it doesn't have a playoff implication on the line. There's not that playoff belt hanging above the proverbial game. That's new. So I never started to view the sport like that. So I guess maybe you and I look at it through a different lens, because I don't watch games like that. I don't need playoff ramifications on the line for a college football game to mean something to me. And I think now the way I see this is, even if someone were to agree with me on that, sometimes they'll say, okay, but now since that's where we are, we need to expand, because now the only thing that means anything is if there's a playoff spot on the line. So we need more playoff spots, which is like taking the folks who made the mess and telling them, give me more of what made the mess to fix the mess, which of course doesn't work for me, but it's the way we're going.
Okay, so in terms of realignment, I mean, we're seeing realignment occur. What does this do for realignment in college football?
I think it's interesting that if this is approved by the commissioners, which still has to happen, if you read Dennis's story, that's the step we're at right now. It still has to be approved by the conference commissioners. If that's the case, I think there's a lot of trading and a lot of backroom sort of handshake agreements on this of, I'll sign off on it if you give me this, et cetera. No one's going to admit that publicly, but I think that's what's going on. So I think it's really interesting that if the Pac-12 is able to get that 6th highest rated conference champ clause built in, which it looks like it is, they've got themselves a shot. The Big 12, they've got themselves a shot. The G5, they still technically have themselves a shot. So I guess when it comes to conference realignment, what I focus on more is, because you're going to have more playoff spots, I think people will be a little more willing to up, let's say, their conference slate to 9 games in the SEC instead of 8. They've already done that elsewhere. I think you'll see more aggressive out-of-conference scheduling, and that's a good thing. I'm not ignorant enough to refuse to acknowledge there are some positive aspects of this. Overall, though, I don't think in the aggregate it is a positive.
Josh, love your opinion as always. Thanks for hopping on with us here at HQ to discuss this breaking news that the college football playoff is expanding to 12 teams. And of course, if you want to hear more from Josh, Late Kick with Josh Pate, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It is live on YouTube. It is also live on Facebook. You can certainly bet that the expansion of the playoff is going to be a topic of conversation this Sunday on Late Kick with Josh Pate at 8 p.m. Eastern.
2024. Let's welcome in the guys behind the Cover 3 podcast. We have Chip Patterson, Tom Fornelli, and Barrett Sallee. This looked like it was dead in the water, and all of a sudden, guys, it is here. Chip, we'll start with you. Just your reaction to the playoff now expanding to 12 teams.
First, I knew we would get here eventually. I think that there was just far too much money on the table when you expand the playoffs. You are literally adding more games. You are literally setting this up so that there can be more profit. You can have more bidders. I mean, the business of college athletics is all about the actual games and the live action on television. So I knew that we would always get here. But an expanded playoff in general, I do think is bad for the fans. I think that the fan who does not have a school that is competing for a national championship, which is most of college football, when all of the conversation is going to be on the playoff even more than it is already because of this expanded field, you're going to feel lost and you're going to feel left behind. I'll say it's good for me because that means that the month of December is now going to include these big games of significance all the way through the month. But when I try to think about the college football fan, especially the one who's not an Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State fan, you're going to find that the discussion around the regular season includes you less and less. And nothing says that more than the fact that they made this daggum announcement in the middle of week 1. Disrespectful to the week 1 games.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, actually, there, Chip, that you mentioned, is the fact that they're announcing it right now before the Friday night games start and before the first full Saturday slate of the season starts means the entire conversation around college football this weekend will not be on any of the games that are being played to start the year. They're all going to be about the college football playoff expanding to 12 teams. And I'm with you, Chip. I mean, this was an inevitability. We've known it was coming for a while. I'm not exactly excited about it, but this is an era where we've seen the TV contracts are exploding. The Big Ten just signed a giant new deal, which is going to be paying it over $1 billion a year. The regular season only has so many games and so much room for it. The best way to increase the television revenues that the conferences have been getting is to increase the playoffs. So they will talk about how it's to expand the field and make it more interesting for fans of teams that might feel like they don't have a choice. But the reality is, in the long run, it's going to be the same 15 to 20 teams competing for those 12 spots every year. It's going to be the same 5 or 6 teams that actually have a chance to win the national title. And we'll probably be bored of this one again in another 10 years and say we need to go to 16 or 20.
I mean, I feel the same way as both of you guys. And so your points in my mind are valid. I'll go ahead and expand it to this. Tom, you just said the same teams are going to get in. My answer to all of these questions is, why do we favor access over excellence? Access doesn't mean anything in college football. I hate it. I hate divisions in pro sports. I hate allowing automatic qualifiers in college football. Now, granted, there's probably going to be the 6 that aren't necessarily designated for a conference when all is said and done. But just because you win your conference doesn't mean that you're championship caliber. If you're a 2 or 3 loss team, look at last year, right? Does Ole Miss, does Michigan State, does Baylor, do they deserve national championships? Do they have comparable access as Georgia, as Alabama? No, they don't deserve it. And so all this talk about how the regular season's going to be great because people are fighting for conference championships and these 2-loss teams might get in. Okay. I don't necessarily see why that matters. And to Chip's point, it takes away from other issues. We had the backyard brawl yesterday. I don't think either one of those teams has any chance of making the college football playoff now or in an expanded playoff. Yet it was awesome. All we've talked about all day was how incredible that game is. That type of reaction is going to get even more lost in all of this once we expand to 12.
Barrett, was there any particular number? Were you fine with the 4? Should it have been 8? I mean, nobody seems to be liking 12 right now. Was there any expansion that you would be in favor for?
Well, I would rather go back to 2, the BCS. I like 4 the way it is. As long as we could maybe tweak the selection process, go back to a hybrid of the selection committee and the BCS. It's fine. The BCS worked great. There was metrics, advanced metrics now that help even more. I would have much rather had 4 with a different selection process. 8 doesn't go for me because that would be 6 Power 5 conference or 5 Power 5 conference champions, 2 at large or whatever, and a group of 5. So that's not going to fly for me because I don't like automatic bids. In fact, I actually like the 12-team expansion more than what would be an 8-team expansion because you have 6 automatic qualifiers, but they're not designated to a specific conference. So if a 7-5 SEC team wins the SEC championship, then it's not going to get an automatic bid. So, it's complicated. I always say our sport's beautifully dysfunctional, and I think never have we experienced that more than we have the last hour because, to Chip's point earlier, they do all of this stuff on week 1 instead of late February when it would make more sense, not only for this season on the field, but also for the administrators who are making these decisions.
Dennis Dodd talked about how next discussion to be had, revenue distribution between the conferences. Obviously, we've seen the Big Ten and the SEC somewhat set themselves apart. Chip, when we're looking at conference realignment, there has been so much talk around this already. We knew it wasn't done. With this expansion, what does this now do to conference realignment?
Great question, Amanda, because it was something that I've been thinking about a lot here in the last couple minutes. I think it might slow conference realignment, or at least it might slow us barreling towards a world where the only things that exist in college football are the SEC and the Big Ten. And the reason I think that is because we've got those 6 automatic qualifiers. The fact that we are moving forward with a format that has 6 automatic bids to the college football playoff, it's great news for the ACC, it's great news to the Big 12, and it's great news for the Pac-12 because honestly, the way it was looking there for a little bit in June and July, we were wondering if there would be just nothing in the world but 24-team SEC and 24-team Big 10. But now some of those schools and some of those programs, when they're thinking about chasing money that might be bigger or would be bigger in the SEC or the Big Ten, they have to also think about what they want out of their football program, and staying in the Big 12, the Pac-12, or the ACC would still give them a great shot, a little bit of access to a national championship. So one consequence of this, and probably one of the reasons why you're going to be able to get some of these other commissioners on board with moving forward with a 6 automatic qualifiers, 6 next best up selections, is because now there is a value of being in the ACC and the Big 12 and the Pac-12, and that is an easier access to a conference championship and an easier access to the college football playoff.
I think you're half right, Chip. I think that this will slow it down, the talk of realignment and expansion in the short term. I think long term, we're going to see the same thing we've already seen. Because if you look at the landscape of college sports, as we talked about with television deals, the playoff is being expanded because they want to get more money for television. Conferences have been expanding, particularly the Big Ten and the SEC, because they want to get more money for their television deals. But as you look around, there are a lot fewer schools available to them that could really increase their profile and increase their ability to gain revenue on an annual basis. But in the new college football playoff, if revenue distribution ends up being a function of how many teams you get in the playoff, well, suddenly the SEC and the Big Ten are going to look around and say, well, we can add these teams, and if we add these teams, we'll get more teams in the playoff, and then we'll get a bigger share, and that might be our only way to increase revenue on an annual basis. So I think short term, it slows things down. The Big 12, the Pac-12, and the ACC take a breath of relief, but I think long term, we're still heading in the same direction we've been heading the entire time, the Big Ten and the SEC dominating this sport.
Barrett, same question to you. I mean, when it comes to conference realignment, speed up or slow down?
I think it's going to slow it down, like Tom said, in the short term, because there's no reason to expand upon this. Tom's right, Chip's right. The Pac-12, the ACC, the Big 12 are jumping for joy right now because if the proposal from last summer goes through, then the access that they feared might not exist now it exists. And that's why if I'm Kevin Warren and I'm Greg Sankey, I go to these commissioners meetings next week and say, at 12 at large or we walk, and just see what happens. Because it's not going to go that way, but at least make it known that, hey, you know what? We're not in the business of letting lesser teams out of the Pac-12 or Big 12 in. So I do think it will slow everything down. That way Texas and Oklahoma get in the SEC. The 4 new teams can get to the Big 12. USC and UCLA can get across and then sort of take a breath, calm things down, and see where we are. I do think, like Chip said, eventually we're going to get there. Tom said this as well. But here's the thing about this whole situation the last 2-3 months that I think, sort of gets lost in this conversation. It's almost like everyone's scared of it being Big Ten, SEC, everybody else. That's what it is now. Like, how is that bad? If that's what the problem is now, it's going to be like that in the future. So why do we even care? So, I think in the end, we're probably going to have 4 16-team super conferences. I do think we're going to hit the pause button, but then it's going to pick back up once we get settled into this new format.
So, Tom, if you're a Group of 5 school, how are you feeling right now?
Not great. I mean, I think you're just hoping that you still get your breadcrumbs and they still give you one chance, and then they'll throw you up against the best team that's playing in the first round. You'll take your loss, you'll take your paycheck, you'll go home and hope you get invited back next year.
Chip, really quickly, Dennis was talking about a progressive playoff, saying starting around the second week of December, may have games Christmas week. What does this do to bowl games?
It turns them into sideshow entertainment, and I think that actually this is a little bit interesting because we have seen the programming around the college football bowl games really just pushing all towards the playoff, which at this current calendar has always been a way off in the distance. I think that all we'll see then is instead of, spending every halftime show of a bowl game pumping up the playoff that's going to be coming, I think what we're going to have is just promotion of the games that are more upcoming. The idea of getting college football playoff games and an expanded playoff within our current bowl structure does appeal to me. I would rather do that than stretch the season into February. So I think that we have always, in the college football playoff era, used the bowls as a way to discuss the playoff. And now we've just got more games to discuss and a little bit more urgency with those discussions.
We've already seen so many players skip out on so many of those bowl games as the years roll along. Not sure how this will look when this expansion does come. Guys, thank you so much. I know you'll be hopping on the podcast soon here to record an emergency pod, most likely here, Cover 3 podcast. Those are the 3 guys behind it, along with Danny Cannell. Everything you need to know about the world of college football, which is changing fast and furious by the day. College football playoff expansion heading to 12 teams as soon as 2024.
Let's bring in senior college football writer Dennis Dodd to talk about this. Dennis, earlier this year it looked like playoff expansion was dead in the water. So how did we get to this point where now we're expanding to 12 teams?
Well, Jeremy, I think the level of frustration by the presidents who really oversee the entire enterprise had gotten to the point that, look, let us get in the room and talk about the issues and decide this because they had just become fed up with the commissioners. You're right. In February, we were told, there was a press release, it was dead in the water. And even if they approved it then, there was not enough time to get hotel rooms, not enough time to bid on cities. And now suddenly, 8 months later, there is enough time. And the presidents have taken over, which, look, they should. I think the commissioners kind of botched this. We saw how this went about, where they voted on January 10th in Indianapolis 8-3-4, but it needed to be unanimous. So today, what we know for sure is the presidents of the ACC, Big Ten, and Pac-12 went against their commissioners and voted for a 12-team playoff.
So, Dennis, how lucrative of a change are we talking about here in terms of revenue for college football?
Well, it's at least a 2x increase, according to industry sources. The current AAV, annual average value for the current 14 playoff, is $600 million per year. It's backloaded at the end of a 12-year contract, but that's a secondary conversation. This one with 12 is worth at least $1.2 billion a year. And that may be conservative, but that's where I'm going with right now after talking to several people about how much it's worth. So now double what the old one was worth. And think about the access here, Jeremy. Instead of 3 games, you've got now 11. Instead of 4 teams, you've got 12. The access triples. And I think that's what's all about. The next discussion to be had is what about revenue distribution in a climate, Jeremy, where obviously the Big Ten and SEC have separated themselves. Do they walk in the room next Thursday in Dallas and say, we want 50%, total 50% of the revenue? I don't think they can. I think what they're going to do is be very fair and trade money that they would give some of these smaller conferences for access. Look, you've got access now. You can brand your conference. You can brand your games. Everyone means something. As Bob Bowlesby told me, the former Big 12 commissioner, this makes sense because you get to November 1st, and the way they modeled it out is that there's 30 or 40 teams we're talking about for those 12 spots. I think that's very exciting for college football.
Dennis, we've heard 2026, 2024 is possibly the soonest that it could come in. I mean, what's your feeling in terms of the timeline for the change?
I just talked to a source close to the situation, and he told me, quote, as soon as possible. Now, it may not be possible to get ready for 2024. I just told you that, look, they don't have hotels booked. They don't have cities to bid on yet. They do have 2 championship sites already in place, Atlanta, Miami, for the 25 and 26 games. Those won't change. But the significance of 24 is that for the last 2 years of the contract, then ESPN would control that expanded playoff. And then I would assume it would go to market. If they go to 26, then the 12-year term of the ESPN deal runs out after the 26-game, 25 season, and then it goes out to the highest biders. So make no mistake, this is going to be a multi-bid, multi-network carrier of this playoff. You just saw what the Big Ten got for having, 4 or 5 partners. They got $1.2 billion or over $8 billion for a 7-year contract. That's one conference. I just told you it'd be worth $1.2 billion for the entire enterprise. I might be way low.
Well, and then part of it too is that, now you've got streaming services that are coming in and certainly wanting access to those rights. So it certainly opens up in terms of the competition, trying to get a piece of that pie. Dennis, in terms of the format, I know they still have to decide kind of the finer points of it, but we talk about 6 highest ranked conference champions and then 6 at-large teams. I mean, are there any finer points there in terms of what you know about what they'd be looking at in terms of the teams that could make the playoff?
Well, if it goes through as modeled, and look, I'm just parroting what happened last June when they presented this, and it was very favorably received before it all got mucked up by those other conferences protesting, is that there would be 4 byes at the top. Notre Dame would never have a bye. If Notre Dame finishes number 1 in the country, they don't get a bye. The highest they can finish is number 5 in the rankings by the selection committee, and they would have to play that extra game, win 4 no matter what, to get to a national championship. So that's the situation with Notre Dame. But they traded that for access. In other words, they're going to get in anyway at number 5, and they don't have to worry about being in the top 4, nor do the power conferences, I think, want Notre Dame competing for the top 4. But they traded that away. So that's what we know right now. It will be a progressive playoff. It would start the second week, if I recall, of December, somewhere down in there. We may have games Christmas week, which has never happened. We've had bowl games, but we've never had meaningful playoff games Christmas week, which would be huge for the networks. That's the biggest advertising week of the season on television. And then the championship game would be played somewhere where it is right now, maybe the 15th or after, with a bye week built in there for the teams to get ready.
Senior college football writer Dennis Dodd joining us to discuss the breaking news. The college football playoff is set to expand to a dozen teams, possibly as soon as 2024. Thank you very much, Dennis, on top of it, as always, and continuing to provide us with all of the latest information. In terms of the odds to win the college football playoff for this coming season, which we are, of course, in week 1, it is Alabama, the favorites, at plus 180. Then you have Ohio State at 3-1, and Georgia, the defending national champions, at plus 425.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.